If you think about it, destruction, Khurban, and Galut, being sent into the exile so many times in our history, that has, in a certain, almost refreshing respect, brought us many of the most structured books that our tradition has. For example, the Sidur. The Sidur came about after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, right? It was the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, Ezra HaSofer, and together with this group of rabbis and scholars at the time who came together and said, we need to find a way to find a certain solidarity. Until now, prayer has been in almost an ad hoc fashion. We have to structure ourselves. Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, post-destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, gave us prayers, berachot. Post-destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, Mishnah, right? We're all familiar with that. Until the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, until Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, some 60 or so years later, we didn't have Mishnayot as a corpus of texts. Mishnayot, Torah Sheba'al Peh, was all oral. And as a result, you weren't able to consult with the text. It brought the second destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash for the realization that we need a certain text. And thirdly, for what I'd like to focus on, there's the construction of the book called Shulchan Aruch, right? Written in the 16th century by Rabbi Yosef Karo. That's after the expulsion, the banishment from Spain. Rabbi Yosef Karo writes about in his introduction to Beit Yosef. He says, well, we're a nation without one solid vision in terms of halakha, in terms of how to practice. What are we supposed to do? He puts together Shulchan Aruch. Now, from a personal perspective, I'll tell you, that sort of thought, it's always made me feel a little bit better on this day. Anyone who knows me well, you can get to know me with this comment. My kids say about me that there are two things in this world that are the most precious to me. They say it's my family and my books. And then they always add on, they're not certain which one comes first. Is it my books or is it my family? It's the truth, it's my family, but books goes a close second perhaps. And as a result, the fact that we have so many classic canon books in our tradition, as a result, as a direct outcome of destruction, of Galut, has always been, I don't know, the silver lining for me on Tish'a BeAb. It's this year, for one reason or another, that I thought about it a little bit deeper. I gave it a second thought in terms of, is that all positive? It's true, I love books, but is the fact that we have books in place of what we had beforehand, is that actually positive for us as a nation? Let me explain to you my thought process. I recently read a book, there you are. I recently read a book by Joshua Berman, it's called Ani Ma'amin. And he distinguishes between two modes, two types of law. The first type is the one that's probably most intuitive to you and me, right? If there's a lawyer, for example, who's trying to deal with a case, they have to analyze the details at hand. They have to know exactly what happened. And then they need to go into the books and they read up on the past precedents. And they have to detail meticulously exactly what the law, based on the text, based on the knowledge of the books that preceded this case, tells them. It's what a posek halakha would do as well, right? A posek halakha, if you turn to them for guidance in some issue, they need to look into the text. They need to look into the Gemara, into the halakha, into anything and everything in text that will prove a conclusion to this situation. That's one mode of thought. It's what you'll call statutory law. Then there's another mode of thought. The other mode of thought might come less intuitive. You might not envision it as law, but it's real law. In my household, as I imagine in all of your households, there are laws. They're maybe not the same type of laws as in the court or in the Beit Midrash, but there are laws. You're not allowed to jump on the couches. And by the way, all these laws are transgressed, but there are laws. You're not allowed to jump on the couches. You're not allowed to throw food at the table. You have to go to sleep at a specific time. You get a specific amount of dessert based on whether you ate your dinner or not. Those are laws, right? In other words, those are laws that we are continuously dealing with in my family. But we have no law book. There's no book, there's no list which details the laws in my household. And in truth, and it's happened, if my kids were to challenge the consistencies of the laws, we wouldn't do that well. In other words, my daughter might say, how come last night my brother, I don't know, yelled out at the dinner table and he didn't get in trouble and I'm getting sent to my room, right? This consistency is not going to be easy to determine because it's going to be based on context. How did he do it? Why did he do it as opposed to you? In other words, the law in my household is a little bit more fluid. I don't know, it's a little bit more natural or organic in that respect. That's what is known as, Joshua Berman calls it, common law, right? That's the common law in our homes. To an outsider who's not involved in the context, it's hard to pinpoint exactly how it works. If you're in the system, you get it. You don't need to consult with books and you can't consult in books. But if you take a step back and think about that then, so books, yeah, law, structure, kind of to a certain extent brings us into this rigid mode of life. Right? It makes things standardized. In graduate school, for me, I was never, and my mother who's here can attest to, I was never much of a student. Graduate school was a time I had a very good time in terms of my own studies. And the reason I'm convinced is because we were tested not based on multiple choice or answering questions. We had to write papers. We were able to put our own life, our own creativity into whatever we were passionate about. There were laws, you had specific details that you had to cover, but there wasn't that standardized, rigid mode. That's the difference, right? Standardized tests is the books that we have today, which are necessary in so many circumstances, and certainly, as we'll discuss in a moment, in a context of galut. And then there's the common law, that fluid, almost lifelike, organic way of living. So now let's take a step back. Let's detail or go through each one of those books that I mentioned earlier. Firstly, the Sidur. So the Sidur again comes as a result of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. We're exiled. Harambam writes about this in Hilchot Tefillah in Perek Aleph. He says there's Bilbul HaGalut, which means to say people now speak different languages. They think differently. They express themselves in a different fashion. We can't lose the solidarity of this nation, but it's to a certain extent already lost. What are we going to do on Sheikh Knesset HaGedolah, Ezra HaSofer? We're going to formalize the prayer book. If you take a look at that, and then think back to what we had prior. Think, for example, the situations the Hachamim point to for the Avot and praying. Harambam mentions this in his Hilchot Tefillah as well. Each one of the Avot, it's hinted to in the text, according to the rabbis, that they were praying. Listen to the words for how they're praying. Avraham goes to the Makom Asher Amad Sham Barishona. He's standing in a place out in nature. That's the description for Abraham's prayer as hinted to in the text. Yitzhak is alluded to in the words, Vayeseh Yitzhak lasuach basadeh. Yitzhak finds siha, he finds dialogue in the sadeh, out in the field. What were they saying? It's not necessary for us to tell us. We couldn't tell you because we can't standardize it. This was a spontaneous, organic, natural circumstance for each one of them. And Yaakov, vayifgat b'makom, he connects almost in a surprising circumstance at the mountaintop, at a very precarious time in his life. It means that for quite some time, prayer from a national perspective, prayer as a Jew was felt organically. There weren't and there couldn't be words prescribed to say. I'm reminded in this context, there was an article over 20 years ago written by Professor Chaim Soloveitchik. And Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who's a cerebral person to the highest degree, described the following interesting circumstance that he experienced in his own lifetime. He said that growing up, he lived in Boston. And he said the synagogue in Boston was simple people. It was Ba'alei Batim. And he was never felt, all that much inspired on the high holidays and the prayers. He thought it was a standard prayer. Sometimes it was a young Israel. Sometimes felt like it was an in and out experience. That was his experience for a long time. Then he went to study in Israel. And when he was in Israel, he doesn't say the name of the yeshiva, but he says he was in a yeshiva of very religious and dedicated students. These were Talmidei Yeshiva and Avrechim who spent their days and nights toiling on Torah. These are people who knew the halacha and knew the proper kavanot for their prayers and so forth. I said, as he stood praying on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the yeshiva, it didn't feel the same, not for the reason you might imagine, as back in Boston. He said it felt not fake, but it felt more superficial. That they were genuine in their attempt, but they were basing themselves on texts. Back home, he says, they were from the old country. They were from Eastern and Western Europe. These are people who grew up with prayer as part of their existence. As a result, he describes the difference between a tradition which was staunched in texts and one which was more natural was the difference between one which almost imbued life, one which kind of dealt with this circumstance in that fashion in which, again, prior to the Siddur, we as a nation, I think, really had. In truth, I mentioned on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the Gemara says that from the day of the destruction of the Mikdash, Nin'alu Sha'arei Tefillah, means that the gates of prayer were locked. Why were the gates of prayer locked? If anything, it was the birth of prayer. You no longer have korbanot, so we would now supplant it with prayer, right? Why should the gates of prayer be locked? It's never a simple text, any agadah, to really decipher. I wonder in this context whether the explanation might be prayer prior to destruction maybe was more far and in between. Maybe it wasn't as common and it certainly wasn't as structured, but that was the key. The difference between prayer prior to destruction and after destruction is the difference between a genuine heartfelt prayer and one in which we have to overcompensate. If I have the words written out in front of me, if I'm reading from a text in front of me, it's a lot harder to really attach myself to it than when it was structured purposefully in an unstructured fashion. That's in terms of prayer. Moving forward, we said also the Siddur was after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. After the second Beit HaMikdash, in terms of texts, the major text is the Mishnah. The Gemara, in fact, has many statements along the lines of it's bad to write down anything from the oral tradition. To the extent, there's one Gemara that says, Kotvei halachot kesorfei haTorah. Those who write down halacha, which is probably a reference to Mishnah, it's certainly a description of the oral tradition, they're kesorfei Torah. They're like burners of the Torah. Burning the Torah by writing down halacha. For what reason? The Gemara says elsewhere that our berit, our covenant with God, is through the oral tradition, through the oral Torah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. For what reason? I think the description again is along the same lines, right? In other words, prior to destruction, the understanding of studying Torah meant injecting my own personality, my own creativity into a tradition that existed. Certainly I was dealing with a text, the text of the Torah. But how did I now extrapolate? There were certain guidelines, but there were so many that were left carte blanche. It was left open to the person who was genuinely approaching this Talmud Torah to find themselves, to find truth through their own creative passion, right? We tell our children, or you've been told by your parents, as we're growing up or as they're growing up, right? Reach for the stars. The sky's the limit. We're always looking for children that they expand their imagination. And Torah, as the Pasuk in Tehillim has it, is Lule Torah techasha ashu'ai. Torah is supposed to be almost a plaything. It's supposed to be a toy of sorts, not in the sense that you play with it and then you leave it behind or you fight with your sibling over it. In the sense that you have that childlike approach to it. It's a circumstance in which you can inject your own creativity, your own passion. It's a circumstance in which the sky's the limit. Your imagination, your creativity is supposed to overpower the circumstance. But Galut, again, as Harambam describes in his Perusha Mishnayot, had the better of it, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the great redactor or editor of the Mishnayot, determined based on the circumstances, we will lose this tradition. We will lose any continued study in Torah because we as a nation lack any homogeneity. We lack any solidarity. And as a result, we can't just allow this to now find its way into the exiles. Without a solid grounding, says Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, it's a time in which it's true in the past we said if you wrote it down, it's as if you're burning the Torah. We don't have much of a choice. So that's in terms of prayer. That's in terms of Talmud Torah. The books which we have, again, the enduring books, the legacy of our nation, the bedrock of who we are, to a certain extent prior to their existence, There was something more genuine that was the reality. And lastly, halakha, the world prior to Shulchan Aruch. Ask yourself that question. What would you do if you, your rabbi, your leader, whatever it is, didn't have a book with which to consult with? And how would you determine halakha? How would you know what to do in any or every circumstance? So it's certainly true the Torah gives us specific guidelines, but there are so many in-between circumstances. How are you supposed to how did they determine? Prior to Shulchan Aruch, how was halakha determined? Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, to a certain extent, he gives us the answer to that. I'll tell you it with a story, instead of his words specifically. The story goes as follows. It was Kiryat HaTorah time in my synagogue in Brooklyn several years ago, and a specific question came up. To be honest, I don't even remember the specific question, but there was a question that came up, and the misadeh, the person who was giving out the aliyot, came and consulted with me about what to do in that circumstance. I was quite certain I knew the halakha, so I told him to do it in whatever fashion. He went, and that's what they did. There was a fellow sitting next to me, an elderly gentleman from Halab, from the old country, who looked at me and noticed what was happening and said, Rabbi, with all due respect, I disagree. So I said, just a second. Finished the aliyah, I went up to the study, I came down and I gave him the halakha book to show him I was right in the halakha. He says, your books, I'm certain, I never doubted your books would corroborate your ruling. He said, but I'll tell you what I have. I have experience in synagogues. I have a religious life which spans back to, quote, the old country. I know the way we do it. So any book or text you'll bring me, it's not going to change my mind on this because I just know what we do. I know what our community, I know what our nation is supposed to be doing. I'm expanding it further. That was halakha prior to Shulchan Aruch to a certain extent. There were guidelines and there were basic texts within which that context we were kind of determining in community and families how to act and how to proceed. When it came down to it, there wasn't something standardized. There wasn't that rigidity of, I don't know, the multiple choice test. There wasn't specific guidelines within which you must walk. There was basic contours. And since as a nation, as larger communities, we had a certain solidarity. We had a leadership which was in line with its constituents. We had a certain march within which we were all going. We were in a specific direction. There was, the word leeway is wrong. The word fluidity is right. There was a fluidity in our approach to halakha. And as a result, and we know this, and the Gemara even describes, we're going back before Shulchan Aruch, how there were different ways of blowing the shofar in different places. In today's day and age, we try to have a certain solidarity, a certain unity in that respect. It was unnecessary once upon a time because as a nation, we had a certain solidarity. We had that unity, that homogeneity. And as such, the book, to a certain extent, it was a necessary step in our development. But had we not had destruction, if galut were not a reality, we would have been living that life, both in halakha, as well as in Talmud Torah, and even in prayer, in which we were able to approach in almost a natural, organic fashion. So where are we today? We today are, what is it? Almost 2,000 years post-destruction. And we have become, for better or for worse, I know the Muslims are the ones who dubbed us it, but we call ourselves that now. We're the people of the book. So it's become who we are. We've become a structured nation. The early Christians, the later Christians as well, criticized the Jews for being so law-driven in the statutory sense. They said there's realms outside. They said there's a development in which, as a nation, you can't just be walking according to the laws and the books. There needs to be something more. And certainly we strive for those in-betweens. But when it comes down to it, as a nation, we are the nation of the book. We're the people of the book. And that, in my mind, until we have a mikdash, will not change. There's something more than just that, though. In becoming the people of the book, in neglecting speech, in giving up on that world in which prayer was through dialogue, Talmud Torah was through creativity, expressing my opinion, halakha was through practice. We gave up on that domain in which we could freely express ourselves to one another, which means to say speech, imagination, ingenuity was once what we were defined by. The Torah as we have it has God creating the world through speech. We have Abraham demanded almost by God to confront him, to argue the case through speech, through creativity, that maybe the statement of God upon Sodom was wrong. Maybe it could be seen differently. But what has speech become for us today? We're a nation of texts, and as a result, we've forgotten or we've neglected that world of speech, of imagination, of dialogue, of argumentation. Speech has become for us a divisive mechanism. Speech is used to take down others instead of to construct relationships. Speech, for better or for worse, but really for worse, has become the side of the center, which is texts. Speech in our lives is no longer a dominant feature. It's rather something we use to prop ourselves up while we knock others down. So this year, more than any, when I think about Chorban, as I yearn for the rebuilding of the Mikdash, it's not only, but of course it is fundamentally about bringing back Korbanot and having that Hashra'at HaShekhinah. Moreover and beyond that, it's for the return of that fluid existence, the organic life of speech, of imagination, of the ability to be argumentative within the realms of appropriate dialogue, because losing speech and moving into texts means that we've lost that ability to appropriately do so. We should all bimhera bi zoche lenechamat Zion. Amen.